Good morning and welcome to this morning's podcast, number 78 in our series of the Psalms. May our thoughts, our words and our deeds be forever acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Psalm 78. Pay attention, my people, to my instruction. Listen to the words I speak. For I will sing a song that imparts wisdom. I will make insightful observations about the past. What we have heard and learnt, that our ancestors have told us, we will not hide from their descendants. We will tell the next generation of the Lord's praiseworthy acts, about his strength and the amazing things he has done. He established a rule in Jacob. He set up a law in Israel. He commanded our ancestors to make his deeds known to their descendants, so that the next generation, children yet to be born, might know about them. They will grow up and tell their descendants about them. They will place their confidence in God. They will not forget the works of God, and they will obey his commands. Then they will not be like their ancestors, who were a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation that was not committed and faithful to God. The Ephraimites were armed with bows, but they retreated in the day of battle. They did not keep their covenant with God, and they refused to obey his law. They forgot what he had done, the amazing things he had shown them. He did amazing things in the sight of their ancestors in the land of Egypt, in the region of Zoan. He divided the sea and led them across it. He made the water stand in a heap. He led them with a cloud by day and with a light of fire all night long. He broke open rocks in the wilderness and gave them enough water to fill the depths of the sea. He caused streams to flow from the rock, and made the water flow like rivers. Yet they continued to sin against him, and rebelled against the Most High in the desert. They willfully challenged God by asking for food to satisfy their appetite. They insulted God, saying, "Is God really able to give us food in the wilderness?" Yes, he struck a rock, and water flowed out of it. Streams gushed forth. But can he also give us food? Will he provide meat for his people? When the Lord heard this, he was furious. Fire broke out against Jacob, and his anger flared against Israel, because they did not have faith in God. They did not trust his ability to deliver them. He gave a command to the clouds above and opened the doors in the sky. He rained down manna for them to eat. He gave them the grain of heaven. Man ate the food of the mighty ones. He sent them more than enough to eat. He brought the east wind through the sky, and by his strength led forth the south wind. He rained down meat on them like dust, birds as numerous as the sand on the seashores. He caused them to fall right in the middle of their camp, all around their homes. They ate until they were beyond full. He gave them more than they desired. They were not yet filled, their food still in their mouths, when the anger of God flared up against them. He killed some of the strongest of them. He brought the young men of Israel to their knees. And yet despite all this they continued to sin. They did not trust him to do amazing things. And so he caused them to die unsatisfied and filled with terror. When he struck them down, they sought his favour. They turned back and longed for God. They remembered that God was their protector, and that God Most High was their deliverer. But they deceived him with their words and lied to him. They were not really committed to him, and they were unfaithful to his covenant. Yet he is compassionate. He forgives sins, and yet he does not destroy. He often holds back his anger and does not stir up his fury. He remembered that they were made of flesh and were like a wind that blows past and does not return. How often they rebelled against him in the wilderness and insulted him in the wastelands. They again challenged God and offended the Holy One of Israel. They did not remember what he had done, how he delivered them from the enemy when he performed his awesome deeds in Egypt and his acts of judgment in the region of Zoan, where he turned their rivers into blood that they could not drink from their streams. He sent swarms of biting insects against them, as well as frogs that overran their land. He gave their crops to the grasshopper, the fruit of their labour to the locust. He destroyed their vines with hail, and their sycamore fig trees with driving rain. He rained down hail on the cattle and hurled lightning bolts on their livestock. His raging anger lashed out against them. He sent fury, rage, and trouble as messengers who bring disaster. He sent his anger in full force. He did not spare them from death. He handed their lives over to destruction. He struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, the firstfruits of their reproductive power in the tents of Ham. And yet he brought out his people like sheep. He led them through the wilderness like a flock. He guided them safely along, and they were not afraid. But the sea covered their enemies. He brought them to the border of his holy land, to this mountainous land which his right hand acquired. He drove the nations out from before them. He assigned them to their tribal allotments and allowed the tribes of Israel to settle there. And then again they challenged and defied God Most High. They did not obey his commands. They were unfaithful and acted as treacherously as their ancestors. They were as unreliable as a malfunctioning bow. They made him angry with their pagan shrines and jealous with their idols. God heard and was angry, and he completely rejected Israel. He abandoned the sanctuary at Shiloh, the tent where he lived among men. He allowed the symbol of his strong presence to be captured. He gave the symbol of his splendor into the hand of the enemy. He delivered his people over to the sword and was angry with his chosen nation. Fire consumed their young men, and their virgins remained unmarried. Their priests fell by the sword, but their widows did not weep. But then the Lord awoke from his sleep. He was like a warrior in a drunken rage. He drove his enemies back. He made them a permanent target of insult. He rejected the tent of Joseph. He did not choose the tribe of Ephraim. He chose the tribe of Judah and Mount Zion, which he loves. He made his sanctuary as enduring as the heavens above, as secure as the earth, which he established permanently. He chose David, his servant, and took him from the sheepfolds. He took him away from following the mother sheep and made him the shepherd of Jacob, his people, and of Israel, his chosen nation. David cared for them with pure motives. He led them with skill. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Today's psalm is closely related to Psalms 105 to 107. In the same way, it treats the history of Israel, and especially the Exodus and the wanderings in the wilderness, for the purpose of edification, rebuke, and encouragement. The past is held up as a mirror to the present generation. It has been one long succession of miracles of mercy met by equally continuous ingratitude, which has always been punished by national calamity. The psalm departs strangely from chronological order, arranging its contents into two principal masses, each introduced by the same formula. Verses 12 and 43, which refer to wonders in Egypt and in the field of Zoan. But the first mass has nothing to do with Egypt, but it begins with the passage of the Red Sea and is occupied with the time spent in the wilderness. The second part begins in verse 44 with the plagues of Egypt, touches lightly on the wilderness history, and then passes to the early history of Israel when settled in the land, finishing with the establishment of David on his throne. It is difficult to account for this singular wandering of the history, but the conjecture may be offered that its reason lies in the better illustration of the continual interlacing of mercy and unthankfulness afforded by the events in the wilderness than by the plagues of Egypt. That interlacing is the main point on which the psalmist wishes to lay stress, and so he begins with the most striking example of all. Another use of the formula in verse 12 looks as if his original intention had been to follow the order of time. Another peculiarity is the prominence given to Ephraim, both in verse 9 as a type of faithlessness and in verse 67 as being rejected in favour of Judah. These references would naturally point to the date of the psalm being after the separation of the kingdoms. But whether it is meant as a rebuke to the northern nation or as a warning to Judah from the fate of Ephraim is not clear, nor are there any materials for closer determination of date. The tone of the closing reference to David implies that his accession belongs to a much previous time. There are no regular strophes, but there is a tendency to run into paragraphs of 4 verses, but with occasional irregularities. The first 4 declare the singer's didactic purpose, his deeply feeling of the solidarity of the nation through all the generations. Our fathers and children are knit by mystic ties and possession of an eternal treasure, the mighty deeds of God, of which they are bound to pass on the record from age to age. The history of ancient days is a parable, a riddle, or a dark saying as containing examples of great principles and lessons which need reflection to discern and draw out. From that point of view, the psalmist will sum up the past. He is not a historian, but a religious teacher. His purpose, after all, was edification, rebuke, encouragement, the deepening of godly fear and obedience. In a word, he means to give the spirit of the nation's history. Verses 5 to 8 base this purpose on God's declared will that the knowledge of his deeds for Israel be handed down from father to son. The obligation of a parent for the religious upbringing of the children, the true bond of family unity, the ancient order of things when oral tradition was the principal means of preserving national history, the peculiarity of the nation's annals, as celebrating no heroes and recording only the deeds of God by men. The contrast between the changing bearers of the story and the undying deeds which they had to tell are all expressed in these verses, so pathetic in their gaze upon the linked series of short-lived men, so stern in their final declaration that divine commandment and mercy had been in vain, and that instead of a tradition of goodness, there had been a transmission of stubbornness and a departure from God, repeating itself with tragic uniformity. The devout poet, who knows what God meant family life to be and to do, sadly recognizes the grim contrast presented by its reality. But still he will attempt once more to break the flow of evil from father to son. Perhaps his contemporaries will listen and shake themselves clear of this entail of disobedience. The reference to Ephraim in verses 9 to 11 is not to be taken as alluding to any cowardly retreat from battle. Verse 9 seems to be purely a figurative way of expressing what is put without a metaphor in the two following verses. Ephraim's revolt from God's covenant was, like the conduct of soldiers, well armed but refusing to charge the foe. The better the weapon, the greater the cowardness and ignominy of the recreants. And so the faithfulness or the faithlessness of Ephraim was made darker in criminality by its knowledge of God and experience of his mercy, for these must surely have knit the tribe to him. A general truth of wide application is implied, that the measure of capacity is the measure of obligation. Guilt increases with endowment if the latter is misused. A poor soldier with no weapon, save a sling or a stick, might be excused for flying from a fully armed archer. The mention of Ephraim as prominent in faithlessness may be an allusion to the separation of the kingdoms. That allusion has, however, been denied on the ground that it is the wilderness history which is here before the psalmist's mind. The historical retrospect does not begin until verse 12, and this introduction may well deal with an event later than those detailed in the following verses. Whether the revolt of the 10 tribes is here in view or not, the psalmist sees that the wayward and powerful tribe of Ephraim has been indeed a centre of religious disaffection, and there is no reason why this view should not be believed, or should be supposed to be due to mere prejudiced hostility. The historical details begin in earnest in verse 12, but, as we've already noticed, the psalmist seems to change his intention of first narrating the wonders in Egypt, and passes on to dilate on the wilderness history. The field of Zoan is the territory of the famous Egyptian city of Zan, and seems equivalent to the land of Goshen. The wonders enumerated are the familiar ones of the passage of the Red Sea, guidance by the pillar of cloud and fire, and the miraculous supply of water from the rock. Verses 15 and 16 bring together the two instances of such supply, which were separated from each other by the 40 years of wandering. The first having occurred at Horeb in the first year, and the second at Kadesh in the last. The two words, rocks in 15 and cliff in 16, are taken from the narratives of these miracles in Exodus 17 and Numbers 20. The group of the next 4 verses, 13 to 16, set forth God's mighty deeds. The next quartet in 17 to 20 tell of Israel's requital. It is significant of the thoughts which filled the singer's heart that he begins the latter group with declaring that notwithstanding such tokens of God's care, the people went on to sin yet more and more, though he had specified no previous acts of sin. He combines widely separated instances of their murmurings as combining distinct instances of God's miraculous supply of water. The complaints which preceded the fall of the manna and the first supply of quails in Exodus 16, and those which led to the second giving of these in Numbers 11 are thrown together as in one kind. The speech put in the mouths of the murmurers in verses 19 and 20 is a poetic casting into bitter, blasphemous words of the half-conscious thoughts of the faithless, sensuous crowd. They are represented as almost upbraiding God with his miracle, as quite unmoved to trust by it, and as thinking that it has exhausted his power. When they were half dead from thirst, they thought much of the water, but now they depreciate the past wonder as a comparatively small thing. So, to the churlish heart, which cherishes eager desires after some unattained earthly good, past blessings diminish as they recede, and leave neither thankfulness nor trust. There is a dash of intense bitterness and ironical making light of their relation to God in their question. Can he provide flesh for his people? Much good that name has done us starving here. The root of all this blasphemous talk was a sensuous desire, and because the people yielded to it, they tempted God. That is to say, they unbelievably and defiantly demanded instead of trustfully waiting and praying. To ask food for their desires was sin. To ask for their needs would have been faith. The allusion in verse 21 is to the fire of the Lord which, according to Numbers 11:3, burnt in the camp just before the second giving of the quails. It comes here out of chronological order, for the sending of the manna follows it, but the psalmist's didactic purpose renders him indifferent to the precise chronology. The manna is called the corn of heaven and the bread of the mighty ones. In other words, angels, as the Septuagint renders the word. Both designations point to its heavenly origin, without its being necessary to suppose that the poet thought of the angels as truly eating it. The description of the fall of the quails in verses 26 to 29 is touched with an imaginative beauty. The word rendered made go forth is originally applied to the breaking up of an encampment, and that rendered guided to a shepherd's leading of the flock. Both these words are found in the Septuagint, the former in reference to the wind that brought the quails in Numbers 11, and the latter in reference to that which brought the plague of locusts in Exodus 10. And so the winds are conceived of as God's servants, issuing from their tents at his command, and guided by him as a shepherd leads his sheep. He let it fall in the midst of their camp, graphically describing the dropping down of the wearied, storm-beaten birds. Verses 30 to 33 paint the swift punishment of the people's unbelief, in a language almost identical with that of Numbers 11:33. The psalmist twice stigmatizes their sin as lust and uses the word which enters into the tragical name given to the scene of the sin and punishment. Kibroth hat Tevah, the graves of lust. In verses 32 and 33, the faint-hearted despondency after the return of the spies and the punishment of it by the sentence of death and all of that generation seem to be alluded to. The next group of 4 verses describes the people's superficial and transient repentance. When he slew them, they sought him. In other words, while the fiery serpents were in their midst. But such seeking after God, which is not properly seeking him at all, but only seeking to escape from evil, neither goes deep nor lasts long. Thus, the end of it was only lip service, proved false by life, and soon ended. their heart was not steadfast. The pressure removed, they returned to their habitual ways, as all such penitents do. From the midst of this sad narrative of faithlessness springs up, like a fountain in a weary land or a flower among half-cooled lava blocks, the lovely description of God's forbearance in verses 38 and 39. It should not be read as if it merely carried on the narrative and was in continuation of the preceding clauses. The psalmist does not say he was full of compassion, though that would be much in the circumstances. But he declares God's eternal character. His compassions are always unfailing. It is always his wont to cover sin and to spare. Therefore, he exercised these gracious forbearances towards the obstinate transgressors. He was true to his compassion in remembering their mortality and feebleness. What a melancholy sound, as of wind blowing amongst forgotten graves, has that summing up of human life as a wind that goes and returns not. With verse 40, the second part of the psalm begins. The first group of historical details dealt first with God's mercies and passed on to man's requital. The second starts with man's ingratitude, which it paints in the darkest colours, provoking him, grieving him, tempting and vexing him. The psalmist is not afraid to represent God as affected by such emotions by reason of men's indifference and unbelief. His language is not to be waved aside as antiquated. No doubt, as we come nearer to the unattainable truth, when we conceive as God being grieved by man's sinfulness and delighting in their trust, then when we think of him as an impassive infinitude, serenely indifferent to tortured or sinful hearts. For is not his name of names love? The psalmist traces Israel's sin to forgetfulness of God's mercy, and so glides into a swift summing up of all the plagues of Egypt, regarded as conducing to Israel's deliverance. Again, they are not arranged chronologically, although the list begins with the first. Then follow three of those in which the animals were the destroyers, namely the fourth of flies, the second of frogs, the eighth, that of the locusts. Then comes the seventh, that of hail, and according to some commentators the fifth, that of the murrain, in verse 49, followed by the 10th in 51. The grand sombre imagery of verse 49 is too majestic for such an application. It sums up the whole series of plagues, likening them to an embassy or a sending of angels of evil. They are a grim company to come from his presence. Wrath, indignation, and trouble. The same power which sent them out on their errand had prepared a way before them, and the crowning judgment which, in the psalmist's view, was also the crowning mercy, was the death of the firstborn. The next quartet of verses, 52 to 55, passes lightly over the wilderness history and the settlement in the land, and hastens on to a renewed narration of repeated rebellion, which continues in the next group, 56 to 59, which verses cover the period from the entrance to Canaan to the fall of the sanctuary in Shiloh, during which there was a continual tendency to lapse into idolatry. This is the special sin charged against Israel at the time of the Judges. The figure of the unreliable bow in 57 well describes the people as failing to fulfill the purpose of their choice by God. As such a weapon does not shoot true and makes the arrow fly wide, however well aimed and strongly drawn, So Israel foiled any divine attempt and failed to carry God's message to the world or to fulfill his will in themselves. And so the next verses tell with an intense energy and pathos the strong and sad story of Israel's humiliation under the Philistines. This language is extraordinarily strong in its description of God's loathing and rejection of his nation and of his sanctuary. It is instinct with sorrow blended with the stern recognition of his righteousness in judgment. And what a tragic picture the psalmist draws. Shiloh, the dwelling place of God, empty for evermore. The glory, that is the Ark of the Covenant, in the enemy's hands. Everywhere stiffening corpses. A pall of silence over the land, no brides and no joyous bridal chanting. The very priests themselves massacred, unlamented by their widows, who had wept so many tears already that the fountain of them had dried up, and even sorrowing love was dumb with horror and despair. The last two groups paint God's great mercy in delivering the nation from such a situation of unmitigated misery. The daring figure of his awakening as from sleep and dashing upon Israel's foes, who are also his, with a shout like that of a hero stimulated by wine, is more accordant with Eastern fervour than with our colder imagination. But, however, it wonderfully expresses the sudden transition from a period during which God seemed to be passive and careless of his people's wretchedness, to one in which his power flashed forth triumphant in their defence. The prose fact is the long series of victories over Philistine and other oppressors, culminating in the restoration of the Ark, the selection of Zion as its abode, which involved the rejection of Shiloh and consequently of Ephraim, in whose territory Shiloh was, and the accession of David. The Davidic kingdom is, in the psalmist's view, the final form of Israel's national existence, and the sanctuary, like the kingdom, is perpetual, like the lofty heavens or the firm earth. Nor were his visions in vain, for that kingdom subsists and will subsist forever. And the true sanctuary, the dwelling place of God among men, is still more closely intertwined with the kingdom and its king than the psalmist knew. The perpetual duration of both is, in truth, the greatest of God's mercies, outshining all earlier deliverances, and they who truly have become the subjects of the Christ, the King of Israel and of the world, and who dwell with God in his house by dwelling in Jesus, will not rebel against him any more, nor will it ever forget his wonders, but faithfully tell them to generations to come. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.